Hello and good morning or good afternoon from wherever you join us. Thank you for for being online today for our first webinar of the season for our series, Shaping the Future of Food. My name is Claudia Orand, and we'll get started here in a few minutes. We'll give people a few minutes to join. But in the meantime, if you want to take the chat and introduce yourself and maybe tell us how the weather is wherever you are. We are in the Minneapolis area, and it looks like maybe spring has finally sprung. We've had a lot of up and down weather with days of snow and cold weather, and 2 or 3 days later, like today, it's going to be 80 degrees. So maybe you can introduce yourself, let us know where you're dialing in from or calling in from and or joining us from, and what the weather is in your area. 26. It is Earth Day. And Earth Day was first celebrated in 1970 when millions of US people came together to protect our air and water resources. This effort actually resulted in the creation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the fight and advocacy goes on today. So we're going to tie in a little bit to the theme of Earth Day, and our featured speaker today is Sophia Murphy, our executive director. She's going to talk a little bit about a quick recap of 2025 and what we're working on in 2026. But before we get started, I just want to do a couple of reminders and a couple of housekeeping reminders. So if you have any questions, then we will ask you to share your questions in the Q&A area. And you can use the chat for your comments, and closed captioning is also available by clicking the CC button to enable that feature. So we're intentionally leaving quite a bit of time at the end to respond to questions. So please put them in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end of the session. And really quick, for those of you who are new, who is IATP? IATP is the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. We were founded here in Minneapolis in 1987, and we're a nonprofit research and policy organization dedicated to the realization of just and resilient food and farm systems. We work at the intersection of food systems, climate change, and international trade. And about 2 years ago, we launched this monthly virtual program called Shaping the Future of Food, where we provide an overview of IATP, who we are and what we do. Sometimes we dive a little bit deeper into our program work. And today, we're going to hear from our executive director, Sophia Murphy. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sophia. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Claudia, and welcome everyone. It's great to see you there. It's always exciting to see all the names and places come up on the list. And as Claudia said, this is really intended to give you, if you don't know IATP, a sense of who we are. And if you do know who we are, a sense of what we're thinking about and working on in a very informal context. And so lots of room for questions now or later. Um, and yeah, to give you a taste rather than to get into deep substance, perhaps. But starting with the fact that it's Earth Day, and there's some beautiful art that we have for Earth Day 2026, which I think is also important to me as a reminder of when the US was a leader in environmental policy, and to remember and remind ourselves that that is part of our history. Because at the moment we're fighting so hard to hold on to some of those environmental protections that we had fought for what is that, 50 and more years ago, and protections that we want to see come back. So this is a moment of reminding us that US has been a leader in environment. I'm sure it will be again, and in protecting our Earth beyond the environment, but all the living creatures on the planet. And I feel like the fact that at the time the backdrop was the Cold War, there were plenty of divisions, plenty of ideological fights going on, plenty of wars being fought. And yet the voyage to the moon, that was one of the things I think that sort of encapsulates Earth Day for people, was also a moment where we were thinking about life on Earth as a whole, and not so much about what divided us, but what held us together in such a small and fragile space. And I think, like others, I feel like the Artemis 2 trip has been a reminder of all that is possible and a very hopeful moment at a time where it feels like all of the political leadership we're faced with, certainly from the big and dominant countries in the world, is so intent on dividing us. So I invite you to enjoy these pictures because I feel like they are an important reminder of who we are, what IATP is also all about. So when we think about it, and as I say, cast back and then look forward, for me, 2025, is a painful year in certain ways, and yet really reaffirming for what IATP is about and what we believe in, reaffirming in the sense that even in the face of adversity, in the face of a political climate that went very very sour, very fast. A lot of the work we've done has been building with communities, and it stands fast. It continues, and it isn't dependent on the whims of political office, even though we seek to persuade decision makers, and we continue to do that and work at lots of different levels with decision makers to change policy. We also are building communities that do the work we're talking about and continue to be the example we want to see. And I feel a lot of that was possible in 2025. We had to do it, but we did it. So for me, I wanted to maybe reflect on two things that stand out. One of them is, you know, IATP is working at this intersection of research, which a lot of it is synthesizing work that academics and think tanks do, but also some of it is original to us. And we do that in coalition work, which is a key part of our politics and a key part of our accountability. Is what we are doing relevant to the people we're interested to serve? And we want policy advocacy that is thinking about the public space. That is what we want to shape our shared public space and keep defining that in a large and inclusive way, in ways that are less exclusionary than they have been historically and then less exclusionary than they are at the moment as well. And so I want to pull out two examples that aren't actually, I think, in the actual annual report, but were important to me for what ITP stands for. And one was the fight to save something called the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, MISA. And I can share more about that in notes and things after. But basically, a roughly 25-year-old institution housed at the University of Minnesota that I think quite uniquely in the country, gave a role in its governance to the community it was serving. So directly having representation from farmers' organizations, also civil society groups like IATP. Some of us formed something called the Sustainers to kind of hold this MISA, this institute, accountable, and then sharing that with the university that by and large funded the institute and that created a dedicated space in a university whose agricultural sort of research and extension was very much guided by and invested in industrial agriculture of different forms. And this was making a space in the public university for the farmers who were looking at other things, looking at the environmental challenges that industrial agriculture created, looking at the economic harm that happened through consolidation, and wanting to build support, network, information sharing, but also research that was dedicated to sustainable agriculture. And there came a point last year where the university was ready to close the institute down. It sort of declared job done in a way that could apply to lots of parts of our political world at the moment, when very evidently the job was not done. And IATP was part of just coming together, remembering who had been served, and hearing from a lot of farmers who had been served by the Institute, demanding that it not be closed. And then part of a conversation with other organizations and institutions in the state, and academics within the university who wanted to protect the space for an institute like MISA, although willing to look again at how and where it should adapt to the new context where universities are in crisis. A lot of the funding universities depend on has been cut. And we all needed to rethink what it would be, but we were going to fight to keep a voice for civil society, a voice for farmers doing sustainable ag inside a university that has a public mandate to serve agriculture, here in the state, as well as more broadly. And so far, so good. I think we found a new home. I think we have put in place the process for a renewal of the mission and mandate for this MISA, and for continuing a model of governance that is inclusive and that engages different stakeholders, including the community that is to be served. And then I think the other moment I was going to look on when I look at our program and think about 2025, it's not a moment or a project so much as this growing realization or awareness of how agroecology is taking root in our consciousness. And you could think of that as a kind of principled form of regenerative ag that is thinking about, is coupled with the world it's feeding. It's from the farm and out. But it's become part of how people think, whether or not they use that specific language. I believe that the possibilities of having much more distributed, smaller scale, multiplied around the planet, the possibility of growing things in a way that is rooted in the landscape it belongs to, that is thinking about diversity, that is thinking about redundancy, that is challenging definitions of efficiency and challenging definitions of what it is to be successful agriculture. I just see it coming up all over, even in the face of an administration that has not welcomed a lot of the initiatives that we had seen begin to take root in the administration that came before. I do feel that, especially when we look around the world, we're seeing a lot more discussion about what it is we want to build back and how what we build back would be more resilient, would depend less on fossil fuels, and would be more intent on the food and the food systems that are indigenous to the place where they're happening, rooted in the place where they're happening. So I feel encouraged by that. And I feel encouraged by the sort of material reality that makes a denial of something like climate change just untenable, even though it makes our work harder in the short term. Um, we're adapting and getting ready for the changes ahead. So looking ahead, I'm always trying to talk about hope, and it is bittersweet to me that that hope comes in from wholesale destruction of a number of institutions that are important to us. But I think that we hold on to the fact that a lot of what we were trying to change has been broken now. And so the challenge is on what we want to build back. We don't want to revert to a trade system that had built in a lot of inequality and injustice, but we do want a trade system that is bound by the rule of law and that continues to create a space where other countries have a say. We're looking for what we all can gain from this. We're not trying to play a win-lose yeah, we're not trying to play to win or lose. We see our winning as something that has to be shared. And I think the most sort of precarious thing for me is that multilateralism, and that somehow is one of the most precious things. The US was important in creating the multilateralism we had. It was also resented and in many ways abused its position over time. But it also held on and did embody a rule of law that was very important to how other countries aspired to change their domestic politics. And now that the US has lost that role, I think that there's a chance for other kinds of thinking, other kinds of democracy to learn from other places. Hungary is a recent example, perhaps. And at the same time, wanting to focus how we continue to keep a civil conversation going multilaterally, because those are the spaces that are so fragile, so hard to get the politics right, and yet critical in the face of the climate, biodiversity, and food system challenges that we have. So coming out of Cameroon, I was at the World Trade Organization meeting in Yaoundé, Cameroon recently. I was encouraged not by the formal process. They've just written about this. I'm not even sure if the article is up or not yet, but the formal process is so driven into the ground, and the US is a big reason for that. But the informal, the conversation going about what we can do with trade is so full of ideas and energy. And we have our own process we've been doing with the University of Bern and IISD, International Institute for Sustainable Development, to look at reimagining what an agreement for agriculture would be. And there was so much interest from politicians, from other civil society groups, a whole conversation with La Via Campesina that itself has taken up the need for a new kind of trade agreement and what would that be. And so I do think there's an unleashing of energy that says we don't have to try and fix what we didn't like, but was sort of working. Let's focus on what we really want to build and how that might be. And there'll be time for compromise again, no doubt. But right now, let's just get that vision as strong and as radical as we can because we want the change to be fundamental. I think there's something similar could be said about the Farm Bill here, about the domestic context. And the administration has broken a lot of the alliances that held that Farm Bill we've had for so long in place. So, what are we building back? How are we building it back? What is the conversation we want to have with the communities focused on ending hunger in the U.S. and on building better procurement systems and creating better, sort of better conservation agriculture and agroecology as well. So the last thing I wanted to say about our program is just yesterday, coming out of a conversation with staff across several program areas around this notion of feeding the world. And one of the big challenges often thrown at agroecology is, can you feed the world? Can you do this on a scale? 9 billion people, how do you do it? And we want to do some fact sheets, the role of the US in this. What do we actually grow? Who do we actually sell it to? How much of it is food? How much food are we actually importing from other countries instead of feeding the world? Are we being fed by the world? And then building out into some longer term research papers around what we know, what is the state of the research on agroecology and what it offers us as for possibilities at a global scale, which doesn't mean one system, of course, but if it were an agroecology vision, it would be, um, thousands, hundreds of thousands of food systems modeling agroecology where they are, but also permitted and working, thinking about the international sort of implications and relationships that their food systems create. Rivers that we all share, water systems. One of the easiest ways to think about it, I think. Things that cross boundaries that we need to discuss. So we're looking at a 2 year sort of series on that and thinking about it. Who will feed us? Who will decide how to feed us? It comes back to the themes we've had for this series all along. And I hope we'll be able soon to start publishing those fact sheets and you'll start to see what we're thinking of. And it's a conversation we're hoping to have with all of our allies and partners to provoke more discussion and to try to change people's understanding of what it is we eat and what we need in order to be able to eat and to start using these crises for our vision rather than see them exploited by a vision of agriculture that is, I would say, backward looking and not sustainable. I finish with a message we always finish with here. IATP is a public policy institute. We're funded primarily by foundations, also by donations from individuals. This year, our budget is about $2.4 million. We feel proud. I'm proud that we're keeping a good-sized institute going to do all of the frontiers of work that we do. And we still have a gap of about $300,000 that we're trying to raise. So if you're inspired to give, that would be terrific. And if you also have thoughts of partnerships, work we could do together, places that we might think about this, where this work would be relevant, then be sure to let us know. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sophia. Great overview and summary. And actually, just going back to the last slide that we shared, Nathan is asking if we have impact or influence data on the body of work that because we had that slide popped up saying these are all the reports, these are all the things that we published. How do we track that? How is that how we influence outcomes?
So it's not an easy answer to that question. And actually, again, just yesterday, I'm looking at taking some of the internal resources we have to be more deliberate about some of that assessment. We actually have several um, experienced evaluators on staff. And so just trying to make the space in our budget to turn that internally and start to be more deliberate about assessing what it is we want to do and how we think about that and capture it. We want to see change that takes a long time to happen. But I think if we look at where things like the conversation on farm to school in the state is and the right of children, the sort of the right to food that is implicit in the universal school lunch program. You can see a lot of the IATP work through 15 or more years of building the coalitions, developing the policy platform, shaping how decision makers think about that and what kind of question it is. Is it a health and education and environment, an economic question, and helping to show why it's such a systems question for the whole of Minnesota to be invested in something like that. But I would say I don't have a handy rubric that just says this is it. I only have instances. We certainly have seen it in trade negotiations. We've seen it in farm bill outcomes. We were seeing it more evidently, I would say, in the Biden administration implementation, finally, of some of our laws on antitrust and competition that has since been suspended. But I do think some of the work of people like Lena Khan, who was looking at sort of undue profits in corporate sectors and undue economic influence, that is something that this administration hasn't stopped altogether. And I think that is like the sustained work of so many farm organizations and so many, there's so many places to look around the country that have held that. But I would say IATP too has sort of held that torch. Um, and it's good to see, even in this moment, that work hasn't stopped.
Thanks for that, Sophia. And Jay actually has a really big picture question too. Jay's asking, how much of dividing us is paranoia? What is real, and how do we know? I mean, maybe you can reference from what you heard when you were in Cameroon, and whether it's dividing in the world or within the country. I think you can probably take it as broad or as narrow as you want.
I mean, I think there's no question in my mind that the rhetoric from the Trump administration is divisive. It seems to me to deliberately call upon a kind of us and them characterization. And in Cameroon, for example, our U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer was just quite rude, in fact, about who had come to that meeting, how they came, how they showed up, and what whether they were serious or not. Um, it, it's not paranoia to say that if you're wanting to start a conversation where you both need to negotiate an outcome, it's not helpful to start by disparaging the people from, across the table from whom you're about to sit. Um, I also think that we see more closely in a lot of the reforms, a lot of what we would want to do around, say, better conservation outcomes for ag involve regulation. And I think that the moment industry sees a regulation that might stop it selling a certain chemical, a certain pesticide, a certain input that it finds profitable, you quite quickly see the debate being a bit degraded. It's become simplified. We lose sight of the health benefits for everybody or the importance of the water quality for all, and we get caught up in a fight that is often a distraction from the kind of change that we're trying to make. And I don't think that's paranoia. There's plenty of industry sponsored but research, but also especially rhetoric, placed op-eds and so on. Um, but I do think that you can't get stuck in that, and I do think we're in a dangerous time for not taking seriously why people have picked up a different form of the news and media. Why do we choose the particular inputs we have, and how could we bridge across that? What is the language we would need? What are the issues that matter to people? And I think that's where we just have so much to learn from, county level work, for example, where you see communities come together on a lot of concrete things that need to change. And that gets past some of this rhetoric, which is often not to do with people's lives as they live them every day. I, it's a risk of going on, but I think that the Operation Metro Surge and the way that ICE kind of stormed into our world, even aside from the extrajudicial killings and the violence of that, I think a lot of parts of Minnesota, however they may have voted and however they may think about different parts of the MAGA vision for the country, they could come together to say, this is not how the people who work with me or for me should be treated. This is not how my neighbors should be treated. This is not who I am as people assaulted by Americans who were assaulted by ICE coming in. When I say Americans, I mean people with a passport perhaps or a green card and yet still caught up in the surge. So I I think that that's what we need to be thinking about as well, is what is it that brings us together and unites us? And how do we speak to those values, not by creating a them, but by creating a bigger us?
Thank you for that. No, there are two questions that are somewhat related from Jean. First, Jean is asking about, do we know if there's a table or some kind of a report that lists U.S. programs that provide support for corn and soybean? And if we know how much of that support is over the past 10 years. And I wonder if, USDA or somebody's tracking that kind of stuff, that soybean farming, corn and soybean. And then in addition to that, Gina's wondering in identifying what farmers can do instead of growing corn and soybean, which is somewhat unprofitable. And I quote, we do not need to undercut. Hold on, it just jumped. We do not need others to undercut farmers across the world with our crop surpluses. Help starving people, but do not compete with local farmers. So guess it's, first of all, do we know if there are any reports or anything available what the government basically subsidizes in corn and soybean? And then what else can farmers do, to kind of get maybe out of that whole corn soybean thing?
I'm guessing there might be people on this call, and there certainly are staff members at IATP who would have the numbers more readily than I do.
Yeah.
The short answer is I don't know those numbers offhand. Yes, they are documented. At least there are different forms of assistance, and some of them are specific to commodities, and some of them are more general, but more useful to certain commodities than others. And some of our programs, like farm income insurance, tends to be tied to what the land produced historically, and so that tends to reinforce what was there before, makes it hard to change the crop. So then, if you were growing corn and soy, it's hard to move out of corn and soy and continue to get the funding, even though the money may not actually say this is a soybean subsidy. So it's a complex picture. The environmental working group certainly did track very closely, like what money went to which farm and what that farm grew. And I haven't looked for a long time at those databases to be up to, anyone who wants to add in the chat what they know about those sources. But it is a huge discussion at the moment. It has always been a trade and agriculture conversation. It's also a climate and environment discussion now. What is the money that goes to agriculture and how do we redirect it? And I think there's a lot of exciting possibilities. ITP is involved in that work too. That's another piece of work for this year to look a bit more broadly at this question of, I wouldn't even call it subsidies, but like domestic investment in agriculture and how do we shift it? And we have some research coming out that we did with the University of Minnesota specifically on how what smaller scale, more resilient, but also farmers struggling economically in this state, what programs do they use and not use, and what kinds of support are they looking for, and trying to create a bit of a portfolio of other ways in which we could support ag that would be both producing less of this excess that ends up in international markets, sometimes to the detriment of what other countries can produce, but also to the detriment of the potential for food production in our own state. So I don't have a quick and concise place for you to go except possibly the environmental working group. But I do think this question of how we invest our money at the state, at the national level, and where we want to see it directed in agriculture elsewhere is a very open, field for policy ideas and for change. And it's a place where ITP is engaging.
Okay. Catherine has a question about what are your thoughts about generating more interest in the food system in the general public beyond the concern about rising prices?
I I think, at least for me, the most untapped place, which is its own whole world and constituency. It's not that it's not an organized space, but the questions of health are huge, and the health in terms of what we eat and what our children eat. That's like I just remember this from looking at organic production 25 years or more. New parents are a very good group in the world out there who are suddenly thinking about food in a new way. But it's also health in the whole production thing, like the recent fight in Iowa to stop the legislation that would have given a blank check to farm chemical input providers, where they wanted to sort of preempt any attempt to limit their products because of their causing cancer. And that failed in a state where cancer rates, I think, are the second highest in the country. But they didn't expect to fail because it is a politics that has been very dominated by ag business points of view on what matters. And yet people refuse to surrender. They can see how people in their families and in their communities are getting sick and dying. And that's not from what they eat, although nationally that's a whole other set of real problems, but also from how food is grown, what ends up in the water, what ends up in the soil and in the air. So I think that the links between our health, the way our health is tied to the environment's health, and the way in which agriculture plays an outsized role in harming our health is something that people are interested in and would think about. And I actually don't have the reference. I need to look it up. But I saw last week an academic article abstract talking about the correlation between caring about the environment is actually much closer to people in lower income strata than it is in the richer income strata. And we've tended to have this assumption that only rich people care about the environment because it's kind of a luxury. And I think that's another myth put out by industry trying to stop changes that we need. Because the people living with that pollution and living with the effects of industrial agriculture are often the ones who are the most active on trying to change it, just like they have been around, you know, Cancer Alley in Louisiana, places that are tied into a lot of pollution from fossil fuels and or mining industries. So I think that trying to kind of foods, a lot of industry plays on food as this like happy picture somewhere far away. People who are in that so-called happy far away place, they know how things work. They know how they're sort of short of capital, how the workers are not paid living wages, how healthcare is scarce, how their water is not safe. And they have a different message to tell us. And I think that if we can carry that plus the possibilities of change, this is where the agroecology part brings us hope. Communities that take control and do it differently have stories to tell us about how it doesn't have to be the way it is now.
And we'll do one more question. And here's a question from Nicole. Have you seen anything from the current administration that can build on a bigger us that shows any promise? And bigger us is in quotation.
Well, I do think that um, the sort of discomfort, this sort of uneven treatment of concentrated market power is something we can continue to push on. So there's a part of this administration that is just about extortion. And there's a part about this administration that is about buying favor, buying forgiveness, buying the rights to exploit. But there's another part, especially in the kind of popular media, that is also about railing against corporate power, concentrated power. And there was a lot being done before in the Department of Justice. And I do think that has been that's been an issue as long as IATP has been around, that we see a lot of money in the food system, but it's not in rural areas, it's not back where production happens, and it's also not evident in the quality of food that people get at the end of the pipeline. And I think that we also needed to break the farm bill. We needed to we need to remake. I don't know that we needed to talk about break, but we were not holding either a very good model of food security for um, people not affording food on their own, and we were not holding a good model of agriculture and farm either. And so how we could rethink that whole idea that those are worlds that should be brought together, but not on this premise that we had that it would be a SNAP and a commodity payment or an insurance program for soy, but something much different. And I think a lot of the work around public procurement has put in place some values and principles that have been, negotiated. A lot of state legislatures have come to the national legislature, and there's potential for it federally. A farm bill that embodies those principles, or principles like them, would be a good place to start. And I don't know how in this current administration whether we'd find champions, but I do think there's room now to talk about the farm bill differently. I can see some good content in the chats, by the way. And of course, if you miss or want something after, don't hesitate to reach out to Claudia and ask. We're very happy to share any of these resources if as they're useful to you.
Yeah, because we definitely are keeping the chat. So the questions we didn't get to, but I also want to make sure we stay within our allotted time, and maybe we have time for one. Let me see here. If there's anything. I think we pretty much addressed most of it. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up for today. And thank you so much, Sophia, for answering all these questions kind of on the go. We know you didn't have a chance to prepare it because you were just kind of taking them on the fly. We appreciate that. And you all heard the word agroecology several times. And if you're interested in learning more or trying to figure out what this agroecology is, first of all, we have a fabulous new podcast. It's called Agroecology Uprooted, where the initial episode dropped last week. And we will welcome the host and the creator of the Agroecology Uprooted podcast, Lily Richard, at the next webinar, which is going to be on May 19th. So if you're interested in agroecology, want to hear a bit more about our podcast, register for our next webinar on May 19th, where you're going to hear from Lily, and she will also have a couple of special guests on the webinar with her. Thank you again for joining us today, and we'll see you all later. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.